You have got the car audio bug. You've decided you need some bass in your car. Here are 5 things you need in order to make that happen. First thing you're going to need, the actual subwoofers. The second thing you're going to need is a subwoofer enclosure. That's the actual box that the subwoofers are going to be sitting in. You're going to need an amplifier to push that subwoofer. You'll need a bunch of different types of wires so you can connect the amplifier to the car and the subwoofer to the amplifier. And you're going to need a way to get the music, the signal, into the amplifier. And your goal is to match all these things in order to get the best possible sound for your budget. Never forget, all builds are budget builds, budgets are just different. The very first and most important thing to understand and pay attention to when you're picking out subwoofers is resistance, measured in ohms. Most people look at the size of the subwoofer and the power rating first. We're going to get to that later. I'm starting with ohms because you need to know this in order to match your subwoofer to your amplifier. So when you're looking at subwoofers, look at these 2 things. 1, the number of voice coils, and 2, the resistance measured in ohms of those voice coils. The most common configurations are single 4 ohm or single 2 ohm voice coils, or dual voice coils, either dual 4 ohm or dual 2 ohm. This subwoofer here is a dual 4 ohm driver. The practical implication for hooking up the subwoofer is that this subwoofer has 2 connections on the back, 1 connection for each voice coil. If we wire these 2 connections together in parallel, positive to positive and negative to negative, that will give us a 2 ohm nominal resistance. So now what we need to do is start looking at amplifiers, and our goal is to find an amplifier that pairs up well with this subwoofer. Now I'm going to look at the power rating. This subwoofer is a 500 watt RMS subwoofer. So what I need now is an amplifier that can give me 500 watts RMS into 2 ohms. If you're just new to the hobby and you're not ready to start major electrical upgrades, keep it to 500 watts. And the possible combinations here are absolutely endless. You could go with a pair of single voice coil 4 ohm subwoofers and do the exact same thing, using the same amp to now drive 2 subwoofers instead of 1. Now this part is extremely important. Only pay attention to the RMS rating. A lot of brands will throw these giant peak numbers on the side of their retail packaging in an attempt to grab your attention and make you think you're getting a really powerful amplifier. This 3,000 watt peak amplifier, I tested it, was able to get about 560 watts out of it. Now let's talk about the size of the subwoofer. That's an important consideration because a bigger subwoofer holding everything else constant is gonna make more bass. I recommend that you get the largest subwoofer that you can reasonably fit into your car. And when you're trying to figure out how many subs you can fit inside your car, you're not looking at the actual size of the subwoofer, you're looking at the size of the enclosure that the subwoofer is gonna go in. As the subwoofers get bigger, the enclosures need to get larger. And the biggest mistake you can make is to try to take a huge subwoofer and cram it into a tiny enclosure. The old saying is that it takes space to make bass. An appropriate size subwoofer in the right enclosure will give you much better performance and definitely give you more bang for your buck than taking a huge subwoofer and sticking in an enclosure that's too small. When you're looking at subwoofers, the manufacturers will give recommended ranges. They'll do ranges for sealed and ported enclosures. In general, ported enclosures are going to be larger than sealed enclosures, but they're also more efficient. That means they play louder. That's important. And in my experience, most of the enclosure recommendations provided by manufacturers are a little bit undersized. So you want to try to lean more towards the larger side of that recommended range. And when I build a custom box, it's usually a little bit bigger than their recommended range. If you're new to the hobby, you're probably going to end up purchasing what they call a prefab enclosure. This is an enclosure that has been pre-made. When you're looking at these prefab enclosures, it's real important that you look close at that airspace because you want one that's plenty big for your subwoofer, and also look at the tuning frequency of the enclosure. Stay away from the less expensive enclosures on Amazon that are tuned around 40 or 45 hertz. Those enclosures are going to really hold back your subwoofer's potential. I've got a whole playlist reviewing enclosures. I'll make sure to put it up here for you to give a look when you're ready to go order a prefab enclosure. Now, if you've got a few basic power tools, you can build your own enclosure, and that's something that I recommend that you try doing because it's part of the fun of the hobby. If you have a drill, a jigsaw, and a skill saw, you have all the tools you need to build an enclosure. In fact, I'll give you a link to a video on how to build a subwoofer enclosure with basic tools. Another important thing to pay attention to is the cutout diameter of the subwoofer. There are standard size subwoofer frames, but not every manufacturer is going to use a standard size frame. This Dayton Audio Ultimax right here, for example, has a slightly oversized frame and it won't fit inside of any prefab subwoofer enclosure that I've found. And some companies make odd sizes that won't fit into any prefab box. And I'll also make sure to link some good prefab enclosures down in the video description. Now that you've got your amplifier, your subwoofer, and your enclosure all picked out, you need a way to hook all this up, and for that what you're going to want is a thing called an amplifier wiring kit. Before we talk about those amplifier wiring kits, I want to say a quick thank you to all of my patrons over on Patreon, with a special shout out to Dylan, Bo, and Baba. If you enjoy this kind of content, I would appreciate your support over on Patreon. When you're picking out an amplifier wire kit, it needs to have these 7 things. A fuse block and a fuse, a long power wire and a short ground wire, some speaker wire, an RCA wire, more on what RCA wires are in just a bit, a tiny little blue wire, that is your remote turn-on wire. Then you'll need some miscellaneous items like zip ties, connectors, and shrink wrap. Go ahead and order some more zip ties. There's never enough zip ties in these wire kits. There are a lot of great amplifier kits on the market. I'll give you my recommendations down in the video description. Let's take another look at these RCA connectors. This is what we use to get the musical signal into your amplifier. We typically call this low-level signal or line-level signal. This is your music at a low voltage that will then get amplified up to a higher voltage after it runs through the amplifier. So where do we get this low-level signal to pump into our amplifier? In your car, this signal comes from your head unit. That's what we call the thing sitting in the dash. And the problem is that most factory head units don't have RCA outputs. They have what's called speaker level outputs or high level outputs. So in order to get the signal into your amplifier, there's one of 3 things that we can do. Thing number 1 is to replace the factory head unit with an aftermarket head unit that has line level outputs. That's a very common thing to do, especially if there's some other feature that you would like to have that your car doesn't. Another option is to use a device like this. This is a line output converter. Line output converters come in a lot of different styles. Some of them are very simple devices that just provide a simple step down from speaker level down to line level. The complexity of the line output converter that you need is going to depend entirely on the car you're installing it in. If you've got a really complicated factory radio, you might find yourself spending $300 or $400 just on the line output converter because you'll need some additional features in order to integrate in with that system. For the less complicated ones, a device like this works really well. This is the XBBR2 from NVX, and it is a line output converter with bass enhancement. Now the third way is to just connect the speaker wires right to the amplifier, because a lot of amplifiers have speaker level inputs. And those speaker level inputs are just like the speaker level inputs on a line output converter. Some of them are very simple devices that just take the signal as it is, and some of them have the ability to process that signal. The one you need will depend very much on the car you're installing in and what that factory head unit did to your signal before it sent it out towards your speakers. Hey, let's go back to that power wire. There are 2 things you want to pay really close attention to when you're picking out your power wire. The first thing is the size of the wire or the gauge of the wire. The 3 most common sizes in car audio are 8 gauge, 4 gauge, and 0 gauge. As the gauge gets smaller, the wire gets bigger. And if you want big power, you need big wire. The second thing is the wire material. There are 2 types. There's OFC and CCA. CCA is cheaper, but it's also less conductive than OFC. I strongly recommend that you go with OFC if you can. Click right here and I will show you exactly how to figure out what size wire you need for your system. And right here, I've got some gear recommendations at various budget levels. Click right here to subscribe, and I will see you on the next adventure.